So this is We Didn't Start the Fire, a virtual panel discussion hosted by the Department of History and Political Science and the School of Arts and Letters, as well as the MGA Political Science Student or the MGA Political Science Student Organization and the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. So before we get started, I do want to introduce us a little bit. We have several programs, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you may not. We have a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science, as well as the Bachelor of Science degree in Interdisciplinary Studies, and minors in areas such as Political Science, African and African Diaspora Studies, Environmental Policy Studies, Local Government Administration, Global Studies, and Pre-Law, as well as the Certificate in European Union Studies. So before we get started with the panel itself, I do want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. John Hall, who is an associate professor of political science here at Middle Georgia State and has been here, well, almost 10 years now. And his PhD is in public policy administration from Auburn University. We're also joined by Dr. Thomas Matchock, who's an associate professor of public safety and has been here in various capacities since 2020. Somebody's saying, Dr. Hall, they can't hear anything. Can people hear me?
I can hear you. I'm not saying anything yet, but yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, so anyway, Dr. Matchock, like I said, is an associate professor of public safety here at Middle Georgia State and has been here since 2020 in various capacities. His doctorate is in conflict analysis and resolution from Nova Southeastern University. And I am Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm the professor of political science. I've been here since 2012. My doctorate is in political science from the University of Mississippi, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. So Dr. Hall and Dr. Matchock will be responding to most of the questions as we go forward. So speaking of our questions and structure, we're going to get started today with a few topics that we've already selected. So I've given both Dr. Matchock and Dr. Hall some potential questions, but we're also delighted to have your questions as well, or if you have follow-up questions, please post those in the chat window. You're more than welcome also to ask more than one question if you want, but we do want to afford everybody the opportunity to ask questions. So if we get multiple questions from the same person, we will prioritize answering questions from multiple people before we kind of double dip. And please do be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window in accordance with all the expectations of members of the Middle Georgia State University community. So we're having a few people saying they're not having sound. I'm not sure why, because other people are saying, well, they can hear me. So I'm not sure what's going on.
Chris, I can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. So my microphone must be on.
I got you too.
Dr. Matchock says he can hear me. Some people can say they can hear, some people say they can't. So that probably is at your end, if based on that diagnostic, very narrow diagnostic, I admit. So you may need to turn up the volume on your computer, or your sound output in Teams may be going to something other than what you're trying to listen to. Somebody has suggested you may want to switch on live captions. Maybe that will help. It won't help you hear anything, but at least it might be able to make you see things. It's possible there's some sort of internet issue or something as well. I don't know. Hopefully, at least in the recording, we'll have sound, and that's so. I guess at the end of the day, if you aren't able to hear and can't get the live caption stuff to work, or at least you'll probably be able to watch our recap later. And by the way, we will be posting this on our YouTube page at MGA, or sorry, it's at youtube.com/@MGA Pol Sci, and we will be there. Let's see. So some of the topics we'll probably be talking about today include the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza and its regional impacts elsewhere in the Levant, Greater Israel kind of region, various tariff conflicts and how that's been going, the leadership turmoil and potential elections in Canada, upcoming election in Germany, perhaps other topics that you guys may have questions about as well. So, without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and start with our first question. Make that presentation thing go away. Answer with the first question. So very basically, it's been a few months since the last time we talked about this. What is the current situation, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Dr. Hall, do you want to go ahead and kick that one off?
I'll jump on that and welcome everyone. It's fantastic to see so many students here tonight, other faculty members. Thank you, Chris, for the introductions. Thank you, Tom, for participating. Regarding the war in Ukraine, or what could be called the Russian war crimes in Ukraine, the war really began. There are many points that we could look at. I'm going to briefly dip into a little bit of history and go back to around 1991, where at the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine used to be a member of the Soviet Union, and it voted successfully for independence. So in 1991, Ukraine became an independent nation state. And for decades after, what was left of what would become the Russian Federation had a particular desire to bring Ukraine back into the fold, particularly with the administration of President Putin, the current president of Russia. Now, I'm going to fast forward through several decades, through the 90s and the early 21st century. There were several political changes in Ukraine. Some elections would lead to presidents of Ukraine that were leaning more to the West, toward the United States, toward NATO. And some presidential elections would lead to presidents who were leaning more toward Russia. As we fast forward, one important date that will get us to the war today is that of 2014. That is when Russia illegally invaded and seized the Crimean Peninsula, which is a large peninsula of Ukraine to the southeast. Fast forward to 2022, early in February 2022, and the Russian military actually invaded Ukraine proper. Now, it's important to note that in February of 2022, and everyone here was old enough, I'm sure, to remember when this happened a few years ago, the world thought that once Russia being viewed as one of the most powerful military forces on the planet Earth in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, everyone just knew that Russia would annihilate the Ukrainian defenses. They would move aggressively on the capital of Kiev, and they would seize the Ukrainian government, probably put in a puppet regime that would answer to the Kremlin. But then something happened. Amazingly, the Ukrainians actually fought off the Russians. By the end of 2022, it was clear that Russia had failed. One of the perceived most powerful nation states on the planet was unable to conquer a much weaker neighboring state to the southwest. So the Ukrainians pulled off something of a military miracle in 2022 by simply surviving a Russian invasion. Now, fast forward over the last few years, there are far too many details to really get into, but we can describe the current war in Ukraine as something of a stalemate. It has definitely become a war of attrition, where bodies are being stacked on both sides, particularly on the Russian side. There was an incredibly impressive Ukrainian counteroffensive, like we mentioned, in the fall of 2022. But from that point forward, this has become something of a stalemate. One important note, in about midway through last year, 2024, the Ukrainians launched an invasion into Russia, onto Russian sovereign soil in the Kursk region, and they are still there. The Russian military, in addition to being unable to subjugate Ukraine, unable to achieve air superiority in Ukraine, has also proved to be unable to remove Ukrainian forces from Russian soil. So that's another important development. But as of right now, the war in Ukraine, again, is a horrifying, unimaginably destructive and deadly stalemate, which everyone, of course, is hoping for some kind of settlement, which I think is the next part of the question, which we'll get into. I'm going to stop right there so I don't monopolize everything. Ask if Tom wants to add anything to that and move forward.
Great. Thank you, John. And there's certainly not very much at all that I can add to your overview. But before what I would like to do is just maybe broaden the context a little bit as well. And before I do that, I do need to make a statement and I need to provide a disclaimer and need to openly state that the opinions or exertions expressed in this presentation are my personal views and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Department of Defense, the United States government, or the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies. So I just want to be very clear. I'm speaking for myself, and I'm speaking as a faculty member here at the university, but not under any other kind of umbrella. Yeah, and that said, and John, I think you're absolutely, everything you said is directly on point. And when I again, and thank you, Chris, because I had the luxury of seeing the questions ahead of time, so they made me think a little bit, and I made some notes. I said, well, gee, what can I possibly contribute that might be helpful? And as I looked at it, I said, possibly putting the fire into a broader context. Absolutely, what a wonderful title. We did not start the fire. And so I wanted to just kind of contextualize that fire a little bit and broaden your observations, John. Certainly echo them and ditto to everything you said. And now I'm just going to add a little bit more to that if I can. And ask that as we're looking at, where's the war today in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine? I'm asking that maybe we should look at that in a broader context and at the collapse of the post-World War II liberal international consensus that we have been living under since about 1945, and where we introduced this idea of the rules-based international, and certainly students here have looked at that as well in classes, but. At the end of World War II, there was this real concern. How do we prevent the destruction that we saw in 211? How do we prevent another Auschwitz? So we really then looked at, okay, well, we need to, this international consensus, a liberal consensus began to develop. And we began to see these institutions of peace, World Health Organization, International Monetary Fund, United Nations. So we saw that at the end of World War II, this rules-based international order that's developing, and now this is what we're seeing collapse right before our eyes today. We're seeing that consensus fray, and to your point, we're now beginning to look at and say, well, gee, was this post-World War II really just an anomaly? Was that peace an anomaly? Are we returning back to the chaotic international space where balance of power is what is the coin of the realm now? And I would say that's where we're at. That's where we're at. We're seeing this collapse. So we're looking at Ukraine and Russia. We're looking at China. We're looking at Hamas and in Israel. We're looking at it well with the collapse of, if there was an order, that order. And I would suggest that where we be. So let's put a finer point on it. Where did it all begin? Where did we begin to see this collapse? And I would go back even a little bit further, John. And I would say that we began to see this peace collapse in August of 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, and that I think was now where we begin to see the collapse. So now we're beginning to see all of these events make. I'm back from conflict analysis. What's the pattern? Now we begin to see this pattern begin to develop, and it was 2008. Then we saw, as you rightly point out, 2014, Russia annexes Crimea and engages in eastern Ukraine. In July of 2014, we see pro-Russian separatists shoot down a civilian Malaysian airliner. In 2018, we see a Russian cyber attack on Latvia. In 2022, we see the second invasion of Ukraine. So this is what we're confronted with. So when we talk about that, we have the kinetic fight that's happening on the ground, and we have the broader war that we are now seeing, and then add into that China. And then we begin. So Ukraine is we're looking at it too in the context of China, ally of Russia, and we begin to see China and Taiwan, Hong Kong fighting against democracy, islands in the South China Sea, Belt and Road Initiative. This all brings us back now to this return to great power competition. And as we look at Russia and Ukraine, we're also now looking at the United States, Russia, China in this return to great power competition. So now we see ourselves stumbling into this age of persistent conflict. So we ask, okay, what's the end? What's it going to look like? What's the peace going to look like in Russia? What's it going to look like in Palestinian territory? Arguably, it's just going to look like another form of conflict, because we are now entering into this persistent age that's characterized by hybrid threats, asymmetric warfare, certainly the end of industrial warfare, but not the end of cyber warfare, information warfare, economic warfare, irregular warfare, and then the weaponization of migration. So all of these, this is a confluence of events that are just crashing into the world all at one time. And then I'll very quickly point out that this erosion of rules-based international order that was shuffled in by the United States in 1945, we see the rise of populism and liberalism in response to the failures of this rule-based international order. United States, Germany, Austria, Italy, the Visegrad Group, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and now the rise of the middle power. And now it's this idea then of the balance of power becomes the key. And we need, I think, to understand that, because that makes statements like, well, what are we going to do with Greenland? No, we look at security in the Arctic. We look for, again, that great power competition. United States, Russia, and China are all rushing to the Arctic. Who's going to control those trade routes? Certainly now, as the environment shifts and those sea lanes open, and so we look at migration, the weaponization of migration. I just wanted to contribute to the discussion that when we look at these specific events, that we broaden our thinking to see how they are part of this collapse of the rules-based international order, the loss of the post-World War II liberal international consensus, and that then these events such as populism and others begin to make sense, and why we're seeing them and why are we seeing them now. So I know that was may have been wildly out there, but I did want to say, at least for me, I'm trying to broaden the scope. Why did China want to be in bed with Russia? Again, back to this the collapse of the order, competition among the great powers. And when I say United States too, I do want to add in, we really need to think of the Western. So the United States certainly is the key leader within that Western alliance, but it's the West really that's competing. So on that, I'll go ahead and be quiet.
Okay, thanks, Tom and John. So John already kind of alluded to this question already, but I do want to go ahead and ask it because it seems interesting. So is there any sort of peace settlement likely in the near future between Russia and Ukraine? And if there is going to be a peace settlement, what would the contours of a potential settlement actually look like realistically?
Well, that's a great question. Again, the international community would, of course, want peace between Ukraine and Russia. If I had to answer, what are the odds good for any form of a settlement between Russia and Ukraine anytime in the near future? Unfortunately, I would have to say no. Again, stalemates such as this don't tend to lean themselves to easy settlement because neither side has achieved a superior position to force the other to the table. Having said that, there are possibilities. This will end at some point. I don't think this will turn into the perpetual, nature of, say, a Korean War that is still technically ongoing. There could be a settlement that's negotiated. I think that is moderate to low likelihood. You could have a moderated, mediated settlement between Russia and Ukraine, mainly for one reason. They are both exhausted. The data on Russian and Ukrainian combat fatalities is practically impossible to find, but there are clearly a minimum of in the range of 50,000 Ukrainian combat deaths, well into the six figures, hundreds of thousands of Russian combat deaths. There comes a point, even for an authoritarian regime like Russia, I won't call them an illiberal democracy, but even for an authoritarian regime, there comes a point when you lose so many soldiers, when the economic crunch is so bad, when the war is going so poorly, that you will possibly decide on a negotiated settlement. So mutual exhaustion, some kind of international mediation. It would definitely involve some kind of territorial compromise between Russia and Ukraine. But I think a mediated settlement is moderate to low likelihood. You could also have a Ukrainian victory. You could have a Russian victory. I think both of those are less likely to happen, but a Ukrainian victory could possibly occur. The continual support by NATO nation states like the United States, many Western European countries, advanced weapon systems, intelligence that the U.S. and NATO has that we can bring to bear. There could be democratic or domestic unrest in Moscow. There could come a point when the mothers and grandmothers are tired of watching the bodies come back to the Russian hinterland. So a Ukrainian outright military victory, I think, is unlikely, but I think it's more likely than a Russian victory. Speaking of which, a Russian victory, I think, would only occur if Western forces, if NATO forces that have been supplying over $100 billion of military aid to Ukraine, if that support were to dry up, I think Ukraine would be very much in trouble. But I still think a Russian success is very unlikely. There's also the likelihood that this becomes a Cold War of sorts that stays frozen in time, that the lines, the southern and eastern lines, kind of become static, and the fighting dwindles with sporadic hotspots here and there. I feel like I've just spent about 8 to 10 minutes giving you a non-answer answer because I didn't give you an answer. I've given you options, but at the end of the day, do I think a settlement will occur anytime in the near future? No. What do I think the best options are, or the best likelihood? I think that would be a negotiated settlement where both sides lose something that they wanted. I don't see the Crimean Peninsula coming back to Ukraine without an outright military victory by Ukraine. So again, do I think a settlement is on the horizon? Unfortunately, no. And I will turn it over.
Thank you, John. And I certainly appreciate your non-answer because I'm right there with you. I mean, I have no idea where we're at. And again, as I look at it, again, I'm coming at it from a conflict analysis and resolution perspective. So those are the lenses I'm looking through. And one of the things I would say is, to your point, this is okay. What kind of peace is possible if we're going to arrive at some kind of a peace-centered outcome? We have to first ask what kind is possible, and I think that's where I stumble. That's where I have a lot. I don't know what kind is possible. A couple of notes I made while you were talking, John. The last number I saw, and I can't remember where I saw. I think Russia can go about another 7 years. People wise, it's got its population wise. It could stay in the fight for another, let's call it 5. I think 7 was the last number I saw, but I think it'd be really, really safe to say 5. The other is that even with sanctions, Russia's selling a lot of oil and gas. There's a lot of money coming in. Some would argue they're making more now than they were before the war on their oil and gas. The other is that Putin has some serious internal political constraints on him, and that many of those constraints are coming from people further to the right than him, and that doesn't put him in a positive position to get into a peace arrangement, peace building arrangement with Ukraine. So you there's these factors I think that need to be brought into the discussion, and that's what really frustrates it, because it's not a linear kind of game theory type of thing where we're moving pieces on the chessboard. And I would also say that the other part is to look at the Russian psyche, to look at Russian literature, to look at Russian art, to what do we gain from Russia there? And one of it is that Russia has always perceived itself, and I say Russia broad Russia's always perceived itself as threatened, as they're at the door, our enemies coming for us, and so some of that becomes part of that Russian psyche, and so it feeds into keeping the conflict going, because then it's perceived as one as defensive. They're coming for us, see, and then you got a yahoo like Putin that points and says, "See, I told you they're coming. There they are. They're coming after." And so then that then feeds into that need to continue the fight and to take care of that far right thing inside of Russia that's pushing against Putin to not do less, but to do more. You're being too right word, being too liberal, and we need to push you further to the right. So some of those decisions that Putin are making, he's making them within an internal domestic political context that he and to some degree has very limited control over if he wants to stay in power. Because as you know, there's always a number two waiting to become number one. So he's got to watch that as well. So I'm with you, John. I got a non-answer. I got a lot of questions. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of variables, and of course, by dealing with Russia, what was it Churchill said? It's a mystery wrapped in an enigma inside of a mystery. I mean, so trying to make sense. Yeah, sorry.
I agree, Tom. One other point that I think that one thing we do have that has come from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in my opinion, and this is absolutely nothing against the Russian people or the Russian culture. We've discovered that Russia is not the peer rival of the United States that we thought it was. Russia is dealing with an invasion of a neighboring nation state that literally borders them. They do not have to have the marine infrastructure to, for example, send a huge chunk of your military across the planet Earth to, say, Iraq, and another huge chunk of your military across the planet Earth to Afghanistan simultaneously. The Russians are literally doing a cross-border invasion of a nation state they are or should be much more powerful than. And 3.5 years later, Russia still has not achieved victory. They still have not achieved air superiority. They have not shown the ability to rise to the rank of near peer rival of the United States or of China or of NATO or of Western Europe. So I think, to me, that's really one of the more important things that we can take from this. Russia is not as militarily competent as we thought they were before the invasion. In my opinion.
I can't, Chris, I didn't jump in there. And absolutely. I certainly can't imagine that Russia would want to go toe to toe with us. I think they'll do everything they can to avoid that. But I just want to throw into the conversation. Many people, I'm sure, are familiar with the idea of the Gerasimov doctrine, and one of the things that Russia can do is just give us so many problems to deal with that it just begins to overwhelm and stress our systems and our cognitive ability to do. And this is what I mentioned, that the kinetic war, the kinetic fight is a part of it. The other part of it is cyber. the info, the trade, the economic, okay, now give us a problem in the Arctic to worry about, and now give us a problem with China and South China Sea and Taiwan to deal with. Now give it so what happens is their goal is to just throw so much spaghetti against the wall and then capitalize on what sticks, and that I think is one of our issues, especially when I talk about broadening our contextual view of it, because that's just a piece of the bigger fight. That's just okay. Okay, now we're dealing with this and this and this and this, and then the system just becomes overwhelmed. I don't think we're there, and I think it's a long way. Something like that can happen. However, I do believe it's a strategy of the Russians at this point. Yeah. Straight on the kinetic, no. 1-1, no, that's not going to happen. Certainly no victory there for the Russians, but they can keep us busy. Doing the whack-a-mole thing. Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris, I stepped in front of you.
Oh, that's okay. No, it was a good follow-up there. So we have a few questions from the chat kind of related to Ukraine and Russia, so I figured we'd tackle those before we move on to the next topic, if that makes sense to everybody. So we have one question. Would Ukraine have stood any chance without U.S. aid? How much influence does the U.S. have in getting Russia to give up? Let's see. We also have somebody that says they heard recently, an hour ago, that Catherine says Ukraine said they were prepared to offer a territory swap with Russia. I don't know if that's about the area around Kursk they've been able to invade or whatever, where they're talking about swapping that for some territory. I don't know. Does that mean that a settlement might happen? And then John Iverson asks, our colleague in theater asks, are there any signs of an uprising similar to the Mother's Revolution in Russia today?
Great.
So, any or all of the above.
Great questions. I'll try to run through them seamlessly. In terms of, does Ukraine have any chance without U.S. aid? There's no way to answer that other than, of course they do, because initially, right out of the gates, when the Russians invaded, when the world expected Ukraine to crumble in a matter of days, they did not have yet a great deal of the military infrastructure that the U.S. and other NATO forces would eventually send. So right out of the gates, they did an extraordinary job of fighting off an exponentially more powerful military. There is no possible way to say enough about the extraordinary skill and bravery of the Ukrainian military forces. Having said that, long term, I think a war of attrition, they would slowly start to find themselves in a position where they may have to seek a settlement if, for example, all Western or NATO aid were to be cut off. I think the U.S. is the leader in military aid with a little over $60 billion. The Germans, the British, the Dutch, the several other NATO nation states have contributed tens of billions of dollars of military equipment. So again, I feel like I'm answering this without answering it. No, I don't think that the Ukrainians would necessarily fall without U.S. and NATO help, but I think long term, their ability to maintain this war of attrition with a much larger Russia would start to affect them. So yes and no. In terms of Ukraine's recent desire to possibly exchange territory, I have not heard of that. That would be a huge development. I think what Chris said might be the most accurate. That might be a discussion of Ukrainian forces removing themselves from the Kursk region in Russia. But that I don't know. If Ukraine is willing to exchange territory, that would definitely expedite the possibility of a mediated settlement. I just don't see Ukraine being willing to do that. They've lost simply too many people. Too much blood and treasure has gone out for them to acquiesce to allowing Russia to maintain control over large, or roughly 20% of their country. And I have to admit, I totally forgot the third option.
Oh, let's see. Are there any signs of an uprising similar to the Mother's Revolution in Russia today?
Oh, I would say no.
Yeah, I would start there with you as well, and just ditto, John. No, no chance. What I would swing back in, if I could, I can't add to what you said, John, about the United States and the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people, uh, without question. Now, how much influence does the United States have to get Russia to give up? Two things. One, I said, he's got to attend to his internal political pressure from his folks inside Russia. So, how much influence do we have? Probably not as much as the internal considerations he has in order to stay in power. The other part of that is now, swapping land for peace. That swings back to Zelensky as internal political pressures as well. You've been engaged in a war for 3 years now, and you throw up your hands and say, okay, well, we're going to throw in the towel, and essentially, it'll be what it looked like 3 years ago. And so now you have that internal situation to have to deal with. What have we been doing for 3 years? That kind of thing. The other is the nuclear piece, which is interesting. We've talked before, I know in other classes we've talked about the nuclear piece. What I would add to again, I'm the first one to say I don't have the answers. I have plenty of questions. And one of the things I would say about the nuclear piece, there are of course countries that are sort of sitting on the sideline. That they said yes. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was a violation of international law, sovereignty of a country. However, you look at Global South. You look at places. They look at this and they see this as a European flag. They see this as a European flag. They don't perceive themselves as having a dog in this. So they're kind of on the sidelines, watching what's going on. Going to see how this whole thing falls out. And as you pointed out, John, there's going to be an end. There's going to be there's going to be a Russia. There's going to be a China. There's going to be a United States. So these things are. We don't know what that tomorrow is going to look like. We got a lot of these players that are sitting up back saying, this is your fight, guys. It's your business, and we're just going to sit here and watch and see how this whole thing comes out because each country wants to make its own best deal on the wild card there is nuclear. If nuclear weapons are used, I think, and again, I have no reason to say this other than my personal opinion, those countries that are sitting on the sidelines will no longer sit on the sidelines. Play that card, and people that did see it only as a European war, only as a European fight, they're going to now be very, very interested in bringing it to a conclusion because of that interest and using those nuclear weapons. I think that I think would be a turning point. And so I before going nuclear, I think there's a lot of people thinking that through. I hope there, because that will certainly, I think, change everything.
I completely agree. I can't imagine. While Putin has talked in the past about the possibilities of using tactical low-yield nuclear warheads, I can't imagine he would do that. Again, China would be completely off of his. China would no longer be supporting Russia. They would be placing pressure. I think only North Korea would still possibly support Russia. That there is no possible way for Putin. There's nothing less intelligent that Putin could do at this point than use tactical nuclear weapons. It's just, it would be pointless and incredibly counterproductive.
Yeah, there's only a downside to that.
Exactly.
At all.
And again, having seen the overwhelming corruption that comes with authoritarian regimes, that has been one of the primary reasons why what we thought was an extraordinarily impressive Russian military has proved itself to be incredibly incompetent. I think the same thing is going to flow over into the nuclear arsenal of Russia. It is shockingly expensive to maintain a nuclear arsenal. And I cannot believe over the last few decades that the corruption that has been rife throughout the Russian military hasn't also found its way into the Russian nuclear weapons arsenal. I would never want to test this, but I do question how effective Russia's nuclear infrastructure actually is over the last few decades.
Thanks, everybody. So we do have one kind of last question about the Ukraine war, and I think we'll then move on to other stuff. So Ariel asks, how has the war influenced global energy markets?
Yeah, if I can, John, I'll jump right in there. As I said when I was talking, oil and gas is all out there on the market. I mean, it's as I said, there are some things, and not everything I know I read in the newspaper, that kind of thing. But the black market's out there, and they're making money. Only China's buying oil and gas, and so that has it affected the markets? I don't know. I think I saw this morning what U.S. oil and gas. I think it was $72 a barrel. Pretty darn low. So I think you look at global energy markets and you see they're running pretty positively at $72 a barrel. I don't know if that answers your question, Bill, but
yeah, I agree. I can't really say much more. I think it definitely impacted Western European fuel prices, particularly going into winters. And a lot of that also had to do with just raw supply because so much of Western Europe depended on Russian natural gas. But I think the markets have had time over the last few years to somewhat adjust.
Yeah, they quickly adjusted to that. They looked at liquid natural gas and LNG terminals, and so there was a albeit encouraged move to move quickly to do all those types of things, but they adjusted rather quickly, and those markets kind of, I think, flattened out. They kind of corrected themselves, and again, I say, look at your own gas pump. Those prices haven't moved very much.
Okey-dokey. So I think we'll go ahead and turn our attention now to the Middle East, and something that's probably actually changed a bit since I actually wrote the question. So that's 24 hours, and my question's already kind of obsolete. Israel and Hamas recently negotiated a ceasefire in their conflict. How is this ceasefire progressing, and how durable is it likely to be? And I think the durability is eroding by the milliseconds. So
I'll jump on top of that. For all of our viewers at home, regarding the conflict between Israel and Hamas, just to give a little bit of a backstory. About a year and a half ago, we're looking at October 7th, 2023, the elected government of Gaza launched a terror attack that on a ratio was akin to the terror attack on 9/11 to the United States if you were Israel. They launched a terror attack across the border of Gaza into Israel, where over 1,200 Israeli civilians were murdered and over 250 hostages were taken back into Gaza. This overwhelming, aggressive, unprecedented attack on the sovereignty of Israel caused a reaction that would become quite devastating for Gaza. In other words, the government in Israel looked at this attack as a bridge too far. They would no longer coexist with the government of Hamas ruling in Gaza. The horror of this attack led the Israeli Defense Force to be sent into Gaza, one of the most aggressive invasions by the Israelis in Gaza since they had voluntarily left Gaza about 20 years ago. The subsequent war has led to the horrific death of up to almost 50,000 Palestinians. It has also led to the death of many of the hostages. It has been a tragedy, and very little infrastructure in the Gaza Strip still exists today. The Israelis have done an extraordinarily effective job of rooting out the vast majority of Hamas in Gaza. Unfortunately, Hamas embeds a great deal of their military infrastructure within the civilian population. So again, it has resulted in a large number of fatalities for innocent Palestinians. Having said that, we have reached a point where a ceasefire brokered predominantly by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt has taken effect. It took effect just several weeks ago. The ceasefire has several stages, and we're in the first stage now. The first stage is the bare minimum of a ceasefire. First, it is a ceasefire across the board, no combat operations on either side. Also, Hamas has agreed to release about 1/3 of the surviving Israeli hostages in exchange for Israel releasing almost 2,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israel. Israeli forces have left some of the more populated areas in Gaza, and the Palestinians have been allowed a great degree of freedom of movement back into their neighborhoods, and hundreds of aid trucks are allowed into Gaza every single day. So there are extraordinary characteristics of the first stage of this ceasefire. First, it's a ceasefire. That's always good. Second, exponentially more aid is able to get into Gaza to help the Palestinians, and hostages are being released from Hamas to Israel. That's the first stage. Now, the second stage that has not yet happened, and there are some problems that are emerging. I literally just saw today Hamas is putting a partial stop to the ceasefire due to accusations about Israelis not following the stage 1 ceasefire guidelines. But if we are able to get to that second stage of the ceasefire, then we will see some significant changes continuing. There would be a permanent ceasefire established on both sides. All remaining Hamas hostages, meaning Israeli citizens who are still over a year and a half later still being held by Hamas, the remaining hostages that Hamas holds will be released in exchange for thousands of additional Palestinian prisoners by Israel, and there will be a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces. If that works, the third and final stage would involve Hamas agreeing to return all of the dead hostages, returning the bodies back to Israel, and then finally reconstruction of Gaza. So stage 1 is just the basic components of a ceasefire. Stage 2 would take that a step further, and stage 3 would involve the eventual rebuild of Gaza, which will take probably decades. With that being said, how is it progressing? As of this morning, it was progressing swimmingly, but recent events that I'm still literally trying to keep up with have put something of a halt to parts of the ceasefire. But the ceasefire I don't think has been formally disengaged. So right now it's barely creeping along unless someone has seen something in the last few minutes.
And John, thank you for that. And certainly there's nothing your overview that I can add in any meaningful way. But if I could, I'm going to jump to the second part of that question. I don't want to get too far in front of you, Chris, but just looking at it again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, how do we look at this broader context? And I'm suggesting too that we look at Gaza as a regional perspective, and to recognize what we're seeing. And the point is that we're looking at Iran's just absolute troublemaking behavior throughout the entire region. And Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, and of course that has certainly shifted with Assad's departure. We then look at Lebanon. We look at move within Israel and Gaza Strip, and then we look at the tension between Gaza and the West Bank, which is an internal issue as well. So we see, we look at certainly a ceasefire and the exchange of hostages, which is, albeit absolute. I mean, this is the humanitarian peace here. You see the destruction as well, and you know, how could you look at that and not be moved this horror that was started on October 7th, and so you see that, you know, the key players again, you know, Iran pushing against Saudi Arabia, trying to stir up. Then you have the Gulf states that have an oil interest. You know, they have an economic. So you have all these players, of which the ceasefire and the peace deal is a part of that, and that just, boy, comes to a huge challenge, trying to put all these pieces. You know, it's kind of like, remember, what was that old thing, that kaleidoscope thing? You look in the window and you twist it, and all the pieces kind of fall into place until you have a pattern. And I think that's the challenge we look at in the Middle East. How do we turn that kaleidoscope so all those pieces kind of line up appropriately? You know, you have Trump's comment about, well, we'll just make it into another beachfront property. You know, we'll make Gaza beachfront property. Right? I don't know. That one again, because again, it's a regional issue. There's no solution to any of it outside of our regional context. And that's what makes it so problematic, because it's just simply not a matter of Israel and Hamas signing a ceasefire. There are other factors in there that just complicated immensely.
Thanks, Tom. Sorry, I was trying to track down some things for people that were asking some questions in the comments. Let's see. So why don't we follow up with this question, because it actually kind of tackles a couple of questions that were in the comments as well. As you're aware, in the last week or so, President Trump has made recent comments regarding cleaning out Gaza, turning it into an international city, doing real estate development there, maybe setting up some hotels. What are the likely impacts of these comments on the conflict, and also how does that correspond to or not correspond to international law regarding A, the status of Gaza, and B, just in general, the status of occupied territories?
This one's confusing. That to have a president of the United States of America comment aggressively several times, as if this is not something that was on a whim, that Israel should hand over Gaza to the United States so that the United States could then remove 2 million Palestinians from Gaza so that Gaza can then be rebuilt. He referenced it as wanting to build a new Riviera in the Middle East. Now, theoretically, the U.S. and the international community investing billions, if not trillions of dollars into Gaza to rebuild its infrastructure and to create a Gaza that could be vibrant and economically prosperous. That's fantastic. There's the problem of sovereignty, however. Israel doesn't own Gaza. Israel removed itself voluntarily from Gaza 20 years ago. The United States doesn't own Gaza, even though the Israelis will never, in my opinion, ever again coexist with a Gaza that is led by Hamas. Hamas is technically the governing body of Gaza, what's left of it. So I have absolutely no idea how legally Gaza could be handed over to the protection of the United States. A great picture there. I just don't understand anything about what President Trump said regarding handing over Gaza so that the U.S. could rebuild it. Now, if there were going to be some kind of a 25 version of the Marshall Plan, and the U.S. was going to lead extraordinary investment into Gaza infrastructure, I think that would be fantastic. But in terms of handing over Gaza to the U.S., I can't even begin to comprehend what that means. However, I have learned, again, this is neither pro or against the Trump administration. This is just a specific policy initiative that he has announced that I'm trying to wrap my brain around. I've also learned to not underestimate the Trump administration. I noticed this morning when I looked at Google. If you look at Google and look at the Gulf, it's not the Gulf of Mexico on Google, it's the Gulf of America. So when President Trump says things like the U.S. will take over Gaza, I have no idea what that means, because again, legally, I don't know how we would do that. But again, yeah, I think it would be great to invest into the infrastructure of Gaza. It's just countries can't just take countries temporarily and then hand them back. Not to mention displacing or relocating 2 million Palestinians is impossible. Egypt will never, ever take. Egypt wouldn't take 10 Palestinian refugees, much less 2 million. Jordan, there's no possible way they would take that many Palestinians. The biggest issue, I think, beyond international law and just the basic principles of sovereignty, would be how would you remove 2 million Palestinians, and what would be the guaranteed process for bringing them back in once the infrastructure had been replaced.
Yeah. As you're talking, John, I think your points are well made, and I again, I don't think I can add very much to that. One thing I'm looking at the chat room mode. Peace cannot be one-sided. Hamas is never really interested in peace. Yeah, I mean, Hamas is terrorist organization. I mean, Hamas's purpose is the destruction of Israel. That's a stated purpose. And the United States and other Western countries look at Hamas as a terrorist organization. That's what it is. And this has caused a lot of tension, a lot of frustration by many people trying to deal with and cut a deal with a terrorist organization, which I think comes right to the point. Is a two-state solution possible? I think that's off the table for a good long time. I don't think we're going to find anybody with any appetite anyway to bring that up again. Certainly not after October 7th. And Hamas is refusing to budge off of its stated goal, which is the elimination of Israel. I think that I don't any more than I can add to that. Then yeah, I mean, how do you deal with a terrorist organization whose purpose and goal is your elimination? How do you sit at the table with that group of people? So I think it's naive on many people's part to think that there are that's going to happen. They're going to sit down and talk this out. Certainly not until Hamas changes this. And I think that's in its what do you call it? Governing document. That its goal is.
Okay. So one other follow-up question I thought was interesting was, so Walter asks, is there any chance that this war is going to affect Netanyahu's standing within his nation? He says he knows that it was kind of rocky before the war. Has the war changed that? Where does his government stand, and where does his leadership stand? Going on, I guess a year and a half into the conflict.
Well, initially, the Netanyahu administration was benefited greatly by this. He's definitely more on the hawk as opposed to the dovish side when it comes to dealing with Hamas. The sheer brutality of the war, as it progressed, definitely lost some international support. But I think domestically, the Israelis have a long history of rallying around the leader when there is an existential threat. In terms of public opinion for Netanyahu right now in Israel, I think it has gone down a bit, but I don't think his administration is in danger. Again, the brutality of the war is really one of the X factors for Netanyahu. One of the other questions asked, possibly one of the hardest questions anyone could ever try to answer: what are the ethics involved in war and mass killing, like what is happening in Gaza? That is a negative for anyone. Again, the ethics involved here are quite tricky. Hamas has historically embedded military equipment in civilian populations. One of the largest hospitals in Gaza City turned out, I think this has been definitively proven now, was the headquarters for Hamas, using civilian infrastructure for military purposes, embedding military equipment in civilian populations purposefully. These are all war crimes that are being committed by Hamas. However, if you are firing rockets into the sovereign nation state of Israel from an area that is surrounded by civilian populations, the Israelis are presented with an ethical conundrum. You have to defend yourself, and you will do anything you could to protect civilian populations, but there are limits. When you're dealing with a terrorist organization like Hamas that uses the tactics that they use, that creates an ethical issue for anyone in the civilized world around us of 8 billion people. But again, regarding Netanyahu, the brutality of the war, which is something of a necessity when you're fighting an enemy like Hamas, by definition reduces support. But I think overall, the attack on October 7th to now has strengthened his administration in that they are much more hawkish than others.
Yeah, if I could add to that, what you pointed out there, John, that is a very, very interesting question to keep us busy for a semester or two. The ethics involved. One of the things I would like to state, and then again, to me, there's no moral equivalent between Hamas and the state of Israel. So there's no moral equivalence here whatsoever. In trying to look at that balance between two morally equivalent. No, it doesn't exist. There is none. Hamas is a terrorist organization that is a stated goal of the elimination of a people. So that moral equivalence is not even in my mind open for discussion. Now, that said, and I would like to highlight what Ron said. When a state finds itself in the position that Israel does, into the question about ethics, that's a very interesting question that we can have after the state has survived. The survival of the state is the number one requirement of the state, and the discussions about, ethics and fighting and this and that and the other thing, they are all conversations that one can have after the state has survived. So if I'm making any sense or treading off onto really some thin ice here and jumping up and down, when we cut the wheat from the chaff, when everything is said and done, the number one responsibility of the state is its survival. And when that survival is threatened by an outside actor, all bets are off until the state has reestablished itself again. Then we have war crimes tribunals, we have the International Criminal Court, we have all kinds of things that can be actualized or operationalized. And I'm at risk of sounding like something I'm not. I'm simply saying that in this instance, in a war that is so clearly, the lines of demarcation are so obvious that to introduce the idea of moral equivalence is somehow questionable, because there is none. In my mind, anyway. And again, I'm speaking from Matchrock.
Tom, I don't want to leave you out there hanging. Having said that, I will like to join you and completely agree. There is no moral equivalence between the Israeli Defense Force, for example, and Hamas. Hamas, again, is internationally by the U.S., by NATO, Australia, well recognized as a terrorist organization. It is in their charter, the destruction of Israel. There is language that might have been removed from the charter referencing that Hamas loves death the way Israelis love life. It is a horrifying organization, and an unimaginable amount of Palestinian suffering is a direct result of Hamas. Again, no moral equivalence there. And I completely agree with what you said.
Thanks for the backup. I appreciate it.
And again, the reason coexistence had lasted so long between Hamas and Israel from, again, the dates, I always get these mixed up. I think it was around 2005, 2006, the Israelis pulled out of Gaza. And then there was a democratic election where Hamas was elected. Fatah was kicked out and relegated to the West Bank. And Hamas never had an election again for almost 2 decades, no additional elections. But basically due to technology, with things like the Israeli Iron Dome, rockets coming into Israel indiscriminately from Hamas, the vast majority that would hit populated centers have been able to be neutralized by anti-air rocket systems, again, in the form of Israel's Iron Dome. So they settled into this almost not peaceful, but a peacefully violent coexistence where Israel had the technological ability to knock out most of the Hamas rockets coming at Israeli citizens. The attack on October 7th changed everything. That was a status quo that the Israelis were not going to live with. And again, I would say that there is no way I can imagine that Netanyahu or any administration in Israel would ever again agree to coexist with Hamas. So the thought of a two-state solution, which has failed for decades, I can't imagine. I would almost guarantee there's no two-state solution if Hamas is involved.
Yeah. No, thank you. And again, I ditto echo. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, yeah, getting back to the false equivalence thing. I mean, I think that, I think as Westerners, as people that pay attention to, conflicts in Europe and things like that, sometimes we like to apply, our thinking about other separatist movements and other sort of revolutionary movements and things like that to what goes on in other places. And sometimes that's an incomplete or inaccurate analogy, right? And the analogy I was kind of thinking of that on my head was like Northern Ireland. But in that case, right, the IRA and all the various splinter groups of the IRA, the real IRA, the fake IRA, the continuation IRA, whatever, at the end of the day, none of them were committed to the destruction of Britain, right? None of them were trying to destroy England. None of them were trying to destroy Scotland. None of them were, yes, they wanted the British out of Northern Ireland, but at least in theory, in some sort of democratic framework that allowed, Protestants to continue to live there and not be, ethnically cleansed from Northern Ireland, right? Hamas is not that sort of deal, right? Hamas wants a Gaza and I guess from the river to the sea, right? They want a Palestine that doesn't have any Jews in it, right? And that's, whatever else you can say about that's there is no analogy between that and Ireland. There is no analogy between that and, say, Catalonia, right? The Catalonians are not trying to kick out all the, Castilian speakers from Barcelona, right? They, the Quebecois separatists do not want to kick out every single person of English descent from Quebec, right? So I mean, I think that sometimes we have this again kind of this notion that sometimes things are not what they really are, and again, that isn't to say there aren't Palestinians that have other ideas than Hamas, because certainly there are. But the reality is that Hamas, for better or for worse, has political and effective military control of the civilian population of Gaza, and they get their way. And so, and as both of you allude to, it's kind of the Palestinians in a lot of ways that suffer from that. But in any event, we do have about 20 minutes left. I do want to try to move on and talk about a couple other ideas or issues, because we did promise we were going to talk about some other issues. And I think probably the most interesting conversation we could have is about tariffs, which I believe may be the only time in human history somebody's actually ever said that sentence. So, over the last, since the campaign trail, I guess, President Trump has been promising various sort of tariffs for various purposes. So we've had, an imposition of additional 10% tariffs on top of existing tariffs on imports from China. There was a brief suspension of imports of small shipments that may go back into effect, that may affect some of the retailers like Temu and Shine and AliExpress and things like that. In terms of the China tariffs, is this sort of a long-term strategy, or is it more of a negotiation strategy that we saw from, say, the Mexico and Canada tariffs, where it sounds like basically, in those cases, basically he just wanted to claim credit for things that the Biden administration had already done. It doesn't quite seem like the China tariffs are in that category. So what is the end game with the tariffs, and I guess on China in particular? And maybe the answer is we don't know.
I think and I'll just jump around real. John, you've been front loading all the way through here, so I'll go in on this one. Yeah, we have that emerging field of geoeconomics. Looking at this as an aspect of great power competition, and how economic warfare is a part of that. And so, the tariffs have become part of this kind of economic warfare that can be that countries engage in. So, one, is it a negotiating tactic? Is it start out with something outrageous and then back off it later on through negotiation? I think John mentioned earlier, when coming to Trump administration, who knows? It could go anywhere. But I would say that when we look at, China has some internal issues. It's got internal population issues. It's got internal economic issues. It has had we know its growth is issues as well. We question whether or not the growth percentages that are being put out by China are accurate. So we see that China is dealing with a good deal of internal structural issues, some of which it has no control of. Population, I mean, you just can't do anything about that. I mean, it takes you X number of years to fix that. The same thing with growth. We know that it's overbuilt, using real estate to prop up artificially its economy, and now that's coming back as well. So we see that then we thought China was going to overtake the United States in the economy. I think it was 2030, 2035. Now we're talking about 2050. That's being pushed further out. Its economy is not as strong as we thought it was. And so, you can look at that, and you could then see this introduction of tariffs and as part of this great power competition. Now's a good time. When you got somebody on their heels and against the ropes, when their economy is not as strong as we thought it was, and we're in this great power competition, you look at it and you say, well, maybe it makes sense. Again, I'm not anywhere in that discussion other than to give you my opinion that from a strategic perspective. And if you're looking at great power competition.
Thank you, Tom. Again, couldn't really add any to that. That was a fantastic description. I would actually, for a moment, like to simplify things even further, and that is just to make sure that everyone viewing at home is aware of tariffs. We're starting to see polling data now that is suggesting that there may possibly have been millions, if not maybe tens of millions of Americans in 2024 during the election cycle who thought that tariffs on, say, China are taxes on China. I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence if you're aware of tariffs, but for any of the few who aren't that well versed, meaning many Americans, tariffs are not paid for by Beijing, of course. If you put a 10% tariff on goods from China, that means that goods that come into the United States will simply be 10% more expensive for American consumers. Tariffs are dangerous. Now, historically, tariffs have been around for millennia. Tariffs are used principally to protect domestic industry and to raise revenue, and in many instances as a form of punishment to bring adversaries to heel. The U.S. has used tariffs in the past. It actually was one of our predominant sources of income for the Treasury Department up until the 16th Amendment, giving the federal government the power to tax our income. The history of American tariffs started to collapse as we go into the Great Depression. If we go back to the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, that was America's kind of our de facto response to the horrors of the global economic depression that were occurring in the 1930s, and it was a by God catastrophe. It created a trade war. If you increase tariffs on other nations, they increase tariffs on you, and it can be detrimental, obviously, to free trade. Let's fast forward to the end of the Cold War. The U.S. and her allies successfully emerged, not militarily successful, but I would say economically successful. The principles of a market economy basically won over the theories of a command economy, or for simplicity, capitalism versus socialism, but that's not a very accurate statement. In other words, the world that the United States and her allies have created post-Cold War, the globalized world around us today, is a world that goes in the direction of lower trade barriers, not increased. So while tariffs have existed forever, it's important to note that over the last few decades, especially in this globalized economy that we've helped to create, tariffs are an economic tool that most nation states have gone away from. So this is something of a unique, at least in terms of the language of the Trump administration, talking about aggressively initiating tariffs like 25% on two of our largest trade partners, Canada and Mexico. That is aggressive, and it basically creates higher prices. Will it create a surge of domestic industry in areas that we had lost out on? Possibly. But there are a large number of industrial factors to the economy that we no longer have the capacity to really jumpstart rapidly. So tariffs historically in recent history are the exception, not the rule. So this is definitely unique on the Trump administration using tariffs as a means of raising revenue. We do have the most powerful economy on the planet, so maybe President Trump has thought this through more than I have. But again, tariffs in general are, again, something that historically we've been going away from. So this is a new development.
If I could, just a quick alibi, Chris. I know you should jump in here. You're probably much more meaningful observations than me. But to your point, John, about tariff, we didn't see that because remember back in this post World War II liberal international consensus, that we had these institutions, these organizations, the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. All of these there was a consensus that the world was better off post World War II. After World War I and World War II, we don't want to do that again. And so, let's open up trade. Let's spread democracy. And this consensus developed. And I would argue now that's what I think is a bit fraying. That I would even say we see collapsing. And so this notion of this liberal consensus where we have trade issues and we'll go get them solved in these organizations. It's going away. And unfortunately, some people are trying to solve today's problems in the 21st century with 20th century thinking. Yes, post World War II, that's what it looked like, but it was contingent. Those organizations and that consensus was contingent and we're seeing that what it was based on is going away. In this return to great power competition, we're looking for economic power, we're looking for economic might. We're seeing each other not necessarily as a collaborator, but as a competitor. And this now is then influencing the decisions of tariff, of trade routes. Who's going to control the consent? Who's going to control? Who's going to write the rules? And that's as simple as it gets. It's going to be us, or it's going to be somebody else. And so you have this competition, this great power competition, where these three big players are looking to write the rules in this post rules-based international order. So that's a tough one, because as you said, we need. One of the strengths of the United States entering into World War II was our strong industrial base, because that industrial base still exists. No. So you look then at tariffs on aluminum and steel in a different way. If we're also looking about, should we because the idea was, well, we'll just go ahead to international trade. We'll rely on each other, and we won't go to war with each other because we're all dependent on each other for trade. Well, that essentially is not the case now. That's rapidly the ground we're standing on is moving, and we're trying to make sense of it. And unfortunately, I would argue with 20th century thinking, when we need to be using 21st century thinking. What's that new order going to look like? What are the rules going to be in this? How do we deal with this return to great power competition? Because it's influencing everything, and that's my kind of soapbox for the minute.
Yeah, I think that well, a couple of things on tariffs, right? I mean, the first thing, right, and Dr. Hall, John correctly pointed out, right, that tariffs were a big part of the budget before the 16th Amendment, but as I'm sure all of you are aware from American government, your U.S. history classes, right? It was funding a much smaller federal government, right? We did not have the scope of government that we had, that we have today in 1920, right? 1910. So realistically, right, if you're going to replace all the functions the federal government does, I mean, in theory, yeah, you could fund some of that with tariffs, but you're not going to fund much of it with tariffs. So at the end of the day, right, the question is it worth a higher tax that essentially falls on American consumers? Most taxes on consumers, by the way, are what we call regressive taxes, which means that basically poorer people pay a bigger share of those taxes than wealthier people. Is that worth that impact on our economy to accomplish some other goal, right? And I think the consensus, certainly the post World War II consensus, the Washington consensus, if you will, was that no, this was not in our best interest, right? And the long-term goal of U.S. foreign policy for 70 years, certainly on the economic front, was lower tariffs, more free trade. Incidental to that, a transition from an industrial economy to a post-industrial services-based economy, and outsourcing at least some manufacturing to other countries where they were lower cost producers, right? Very classical economics, Ricardo, kind of stuff, right? Which you can learn all about in an econ class, right? The idea of comparative advantage and gains from trade and all this wonderful economic theory, which is great for consumers, great for economists. Doesn't look so good if you're a steel worker in Pittsburgh, right, or an auto worker in Detroit, right? And of course, what we've seen is that the sort of people that have joined the Trump coalition are those kind of people that were, quote unquote, the losers from free trade, right? Now the question is, can you recapture that former glory with a bunch of tariffs? My suspicion is probably not. Based on the experience of other countries that have tried it, right? We're not we'd certainly not be the first country to try what's called autarky, right? This idea of kind of self-reliance, right? A lot of South American countries tried that after the Second World War, right? They're going to develop their domestic industry and keep out foreign competition, put big tariff barriers on imports of things like cars and that sort of thing, aircraft. Tried to develop domestic industry, right? Brazil was kind of famous for this. You know, between you and me, I don't think Brazil came out that much ahead from that. So I don't, I mean, there are countries where it was where a kind of industrial export oriented economic model was successful. South Korea, Japan, right? But but the point is, they were able to export, right? Because other people were willing to import their stuff. Are other people going to be willing to import our stuff if we, decide to put up a bunch of trade barriers to their stuff? I'm not entirely sure, right? But I think the other point, right, is that the as Dr. Mattrock is fond of reminding us, right, this whole rule-based international order was in America's self-interest, right? I mean, that's why we set it up, right? And free trade was part of that, and so. What has changed? Has anything really changed significantly about our self-interest to do that, or is it just the political winds have shifted where a group of people that don't think it is in our self-interest have gained power? I don't know what the answer is there either, but I would say that it does seem to be of a piece of kind of a belief, perhaps, that we're going to withdraw from global leadership. Is that a good thing? I don't know. My suspicion, though, is that anything that's good for for China, which I think is our main great power competitor, it's going to be what's in the Chinese regime's best interest and not ours, right? So do with that what you will. I don't know. Anyway. We have more or less run out of time. Oh, sure. Yeah, sure, Tom.
Very, very quickly on that, because I think you made a point that can't be let go, because I think it's precedent. I mean, it's just so key, and we haven't talked about it up to this point, but and I'd love to hear you speak more on it. And that is, yes, the post World War II consensus. It was constructed by the United States, and if you look at the Atlantic Charter with the UK as well. But yes, it was in our self-interest. And here we are, last country standing essentially. We're going to now go ahead and be a magnanimous leader in the world, and we're going to not be kind of an imperialistic country, but we're going to operate with our allies in the horizontal. This is going to be our diplomacy. The Marshall Plan is this was wonderful, right? We were going to now lead, and so this consensus builds itself. And I mentioned about different organizations, the UN and World Trade and World Health and so forth and so on, and in this open economic system and trade and all that. And here's the rub. Who benefited the most? Russia and China. And so this order that we built, Russia and China benefited from immensely. And so that then I think is the point, Chris, that I thought you made that I just wanted to keep a little bit more on. Because now, as they enter this great power competition, because the liberal international rules-based order was so successful, they benefited from all of them, and now are our major competitor in the world. Certainly a very economically aggressive China, well, the Road and Belt Initiative, and I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to go off on that, but that I think that was the key point. They benefit from the order that we built. And they are now challenging that very order that they benefited from, to include the BRICS nations, the middle power nations, and all those others that benefited immensely what the United States does.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, it's a good observation. Yeah, and one that's kind of, definitely in the back of my head as well. And I wish we had a lot more time to talk about it. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for our audience, we don't. Want to thank everybody for joining us, including those people that had to leave early. If you did arrive late and want to review this later, we'll be posting that on our YouTube page at www.youtube.com/@MJ Paul Sign. That should be posted probably the next day or so it takes a little while to get that uploaded, but we will get that uploaded as soon as we can. But I'd like to thank everybody for your insightful questions, for joining us today, this afternoon. I'd like to thank in particular our panelists, Dr. Matchock and Dr. Hall. Thank you all for coming out. And we have a couple more events but we're planning this semester. We got another, we got two more teams-based discussion events. We're going to be talking about American and kind of what I might call domestic and interdomestic policies, probably in about a month or so in mid-March. We'll be getting that scheduled soon, and you'll have some announcements about that soon. And then also in early April, we'll be talking about developments in the state legislature and the state politics as we approach the end of the state legislative session in April. And then Dr. Matchock and Dr. Hall will also be having a discussion about the war in Ukraine in person here in Macon, tentatively scheduled for kind of the last couple weeks of April. So we're getting that nailed down, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. They're going to be talking about kind of the Russian-Ukrainian war in a bit more detail, and I think that'll be a very informative and valuable discussion here on the Macon campus. Like I said, probably in about the second half of April. We haven't nailed down an exact date yet, I don't think, but hopefully we'll get that scheduled next little bit. And of course, we'll have announcements about all that soon. So thank you all for coming out, and have a good remainder of your day and a good remainder of your week. And happy Valentine's Day to those who partake. And see you all at the next discussion in I think it's about a month that we'll probably be having the next one. So see you all then.